Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this presentation that is titled Listening and Reading Words, Integrating Oral and Written Input for Vocabulary Learning. My name is Avello, and I'm also presenting on behalf of Doctors Gabriela Gomez and Carmen Muñoz. To start with, it is very important to point out that the learning of written word forms may be quite challenging for L2 learners, especially because spelling sounds relationships differ from those in the first language. For example, when we compare English and Spanish, we know that they differ in terms of language transparency. In initial stages, L1 orthographic patterns have been found to significantly influence EFL learning. And research has demonstrated that this is a source of difficulty for young L1 Spanish learners of English who always complain about this factor. For example, when they hear the word cut, they may write cat. So with this problem in mind, research has demonstrated that the processing of oral and written input leads to stronger memory representations and higher vocabulary gains in young learners. And this is connected to the processing of multimodal input. In this investigation, we combine images, oral, and written text. Research on audiovisual input has shown that visual information or the presence of visual information fosters comprehension and learning. And research on audiovisual input and reading while listening has demonstrated that the simultaneous processing of oral and written input facilitates the reading process, facilitates word decoding and speech segmentation, and allows learners to devote more attention to images, which is quite important because it enhances comprehension. And they make the target L2 constructions more salient in the input. So it is likely that they learn more. However, when working with young learners, it is very important to consider their characteristics. So the outcomes may change as a function of the type of input we use with young learners. So we have reading while listening and captioned viewing. So research has shown that both reading while listening and captioned viewing are valuable tools for promoting reading enjoyment, motivation, and vocabulary learning. However, even when both of them combine similar modes, there are important differences. Reading while listening combines written text, audio, and static images. In this case, the audio guides the reading process, but the written text and the static images do not disappear, so they can be revisited. Whereas in the case of captioned viewing, this type of input combines audio, captions, and dynamic images that disappear, so they have to do it under time pressure. And research has shown that young learners show more regular patterns, reading patterns when processing picture books with oral support. Whereas in the case of captioned viewing, they must divide their attention between captions, audio, and moving images which need to be integrated under time pressure. The presence of static visuals may reduce the cognitive load and help learners focus on the text in the case of reading while listening, and in captioned video viewing, dynamic text and visuals may be challenging for young learners because they are still developing their cognitive and literacy skills in the L1 and the L2. So this is something that we must consider. So with this in mind, we formulated 3 research questions. The first one focuses on the extent to which reading while listening and captioned viewing support vocabulary learning and retention and their perceived comprehension, and how the outcomes change as a function of input and learner-related factors such as story, vocabulary knowledge, and Spanish reading ability, and how they perceive their experience with picture books with oral support and captioned viewing. So it is very important to hear learners' voices. In this study, we worked with 2 main groups, so an experimental groups and an and a control group. The participants were between 10 and 11 years old. They were all in fifth grade, and they showed a very low level of proficiency in English between pre A1 and A1, and they reported little contact with the target language outside the classroom. We implemented a pre-test, post-test, delayed post-test design, and the participants had to watch an episode of Charlie and Lola and read a text of the same TV series, so Charlie and Lola. So this is why even when they were different stories, they were comparable. And they were assessed in terms of written word form recall. So, as they were told, or they had to process two stories, one in each condition, they had to learn 6 words per story. And the analysis consisted of GLMMs by items, specifically binary logistic regressions and linear models. And we analyzed the qualitative data with thematic analysis. So, with respect to the intervention, first of all, in session 1, the participants in the experimental groups had to watch a captioned video, and then in session 2, they had to read a picture book with oral support, and the stories were counterbalanced in order to avoid or prevent a confound. Before processing the multimodal input, they were pre-taught the target vocabulary words, so 6 per story. And then they had to either watch a captioned video that contained 6 target words or read while listening. And right after that, they had to answer a questionnaire on perceptions. Then they had to answer comprehension questions. And finally, they were assessed in terms of written word form recall by means of a dictation. The 2 stories were comparable in terms of complexity. As for the control group, they were pre-taught the target words, but then they had to either watch a captioned video or read while listening. However, the target words were not included, so they were told any other story. And now you know the intervention, but before the intervention, a month earlier, they were assessed in terms of EFL vocabulary knowledge. And in order to discriminate between low and high achievers, they were assessed in terms of word knowledge. So we tested their previous knowledge of the 12 target words, 6 per story, and they were given a questionnaire on extramural exposure. And finally, they were tested in terms of L1 Spanish text segmentation skills. So this was, it assessed lower level reading skills. At post-test, they had to answer a questionnaire on perception, so they had to compare and contrast their experience with a captioned video and reading while listening, and we interviewed a subsample of participants. And a week after, we implemented the delayed post-test, which was the word dictation with the 12 target words. Now, moving to the results, when analyzing the data of the first and the second story, and when feeding any model, vocabulary knowledge was found to be a significant predictor of success. When we talk about success, we refer to vocabulary learning and comprehension. So this is something that I'm not going to mention again because this is repeated in all the models. So when analyzing the data of the first story, we could see that out of 6 words, the participants in the reading while listening condition learned around 3.8 words. So this was the condition that led to higher gains. And the results indicated so here, as I said before, we found a significant interaction between condition and time. And the results indicated that all groups improved and retained vocabulary over time, and the largest gains were observed in the reading while listening condition. However, when analyzing the data of the second story, we obtained similar results, but some of them were completely different. In this case, out of 6 words in the viewing condition, they learned around 2.4 words. So they learned fewer words in when processing the second story. And the significant interaction between condition and time indicated that all the groups improved and retained vocabulary over time. So explicit vocabulary teaching or vocabulary pre-teaching was effective in the experimental and the control groups. However, the largest gains were observed in the captioned viewing condition, followed by reading while listening. So the addition of the multimodal input was effective. Vocabulary gains were maintained or slightly increased at delayed post-test. So this is something that called our attention. So in some cases, the gains were maintained, but in the case of reading while listening, they increased. A possible explanation for this is that maybe they paid greater attention to the written form and they continued thinking of the target words or how they were written. As for the influence of learner and treatment-related factors at post-test, because the results were similar at post-test and delayed post-test, the results showed significant effects for vocabulary knowledge and Spanish reading skills. It is not surprising because learners do not only rely on their L2 knowledge, but also on their L1 reading skills. And we observed a significant interaction between reading condition and story. So this significant interaction indicated that the effectiveness of each condition depended on the story. So this is why the results were not clear-cut. For story 1, again, learners performed better in reading while listening, whereas for story 2, they performed better in captioned viewing. However, we need to consider their perceptions or the other results in terms of comprehension in order to get some kind of explanation. So a possible explanation here is that the stories differed in how much the visual support may have reinforced meaning, and you're going to see why. So when assessing or exploring learners' perceptions, in terms of comprehension for stories 1 and 2, again, vocabulary knowledge was a significant predictor, and we observed a significant interaction between reading condition and story. So for story 1, learners, as you can see here, so story 1, learners showed significantly higher comprehension in reading while listening. So the tendency is similar as in vocabulary learning. And for story 2, comprehension was slightly higher in viewing. However, this difference was not significant, but the tendency is very similar to vocabulary learning. Overall, the results suggest that reading while listening benefited comprehension for story 1, whereas viewing and reading while listening produced similar outcomes. But viewing led to slightly higher gains in terms of, or better results in terms of comprehension. When connecting vocabulary learning and perceived comprehension, we observed similar tendencies across quantitative findings. So in story 1, reading while listening produced higher written word form recall and higher perceived comprehension. And this was the opposite for story 2. So captioned viewing produced slightly stronger vocabulary learning and slightly higher perceived comprehension. So better comprehension seemed to be linked to better vocabulary learning. So this suggests a possible relationship between understanding the story and learning and retaining new vocabulary. The qualitative analysis showed, or in the qualitative analysis, so after the qualitative analysis, we could see that 4 main themes emerged. First of all, attention and focus. First of all, participants reported that reading while listening required sustained attention. They had to turn the pages themselves, so if they missed a part, they got completely lost. So the students were surprised, and I was surprised as a teacher because the classroom was quieter. In this case, they were in the library in small groups, and they were all together, and the classroom was quieter and more focused during reading while listening. As for the role of audio support, they said that the audio supported comprehension in both conditions, but in reading while listening, the audio particularly helped them focus on the written text, and because they needed to pay attention. But in viewing, it allowed them to process the written input, but sometimes it allowed them to listen and observe the pictures, so the moving images. As for the presence of visual support and comprehension, they perceived that images in the book help them understand the story. However, in the case of videos, as the pictures or the images were dynamic, they illustrated the ideas more clearly. So they felt that they supported comprehension better. And as for the control over the text, in the case of reading while listening, they mentioned that they could return to the written text because the text did not disappear. So in this case, when checking the written text or the picture book, it was easier for them to process the words. And in captioned video viewing, the words disappeared quickly. So students perceived reading while listening as more attention focused, while captioned viewing provided dynamic visual support and greater flexibility in attention. So when connecting the quantitative and the qualitative findings, we may see that reading while listening required continuous attention to the written text. They could go back to the text when needed, and the audio helped students focus on reading. So maybe they paid more attention to the written lexical forms. Whereas in the case of captioned viewing, the dynamic images clarified meaning. Videos provided more flexibility in attention because they needed to process the images too. And the audio and captions supported comprehension. So maybe what we can highlight in here is a presence of dynamic images or dynamic visuals that supported comprehension. So in order to conclude, both conditions supported vocabulary learning and retention and comprehension. However, the effectiveness did not only depend on multimodal support, but also on the characteristics of the stories. And learners' vocabulary knowledge and L1 reading skills really played a role in order to predict vocabulary and perceived comprehension across conditions. And as for the qualitative findings, they may suggest that reading while listening again enhanced their attention because they had greater control and they need to pay attention in order to turn the pages. Captioned viewing appeared to facilitate comprehension because of the dynamic nature of the materials, and we may conclude that the findings support that the integration of audio and text supports vocabulary learning and comprehension. So, multimodal effectiveness depends on many factors which are integrated. So, we need to consider learners' characteristics and input characteristics and all the resources available. So even when in both conditions, students pay more attention to text than images, they may pay more attention to text in reading while listening. And reading while listening may work primarily as a form of reading in comparison with captioned videos. So different multimodal conditions may support vocabulary learning differently. So this is why we have to consider different factors when working with this multimodal input. For further research, we need a higher number of participants per condition, and this is what I'm doing at the moment. I'm still collecting data with new groups, and we should also include the reading only condition to assess the contribution of the oral support. However, when young learners were asked about the possibility of doing these activities at home and choosing one of them, reading only was only selected by 10% of the participants. And they addressed this oral support as a facilitator of written word learning, text decoding, and attention. For pedagogical implications, we may say that rather than favoring one condition over the other, we have to benefit from the combination of these two types of multimodal input, and we need to consider learners' needs, literacy skills, input characteristics, and instructional goals. And that's it. So, thank you very much for your attention. I'm ready to answer your questions online. Sorry, offline.